Daniel Phillips stood frozen in the doorway of his apartment, his heart hammering against his ribs as Jacob Thompson's hands lingered on his collar, fingers brushing against the sensitive skin of his neck. The simple act of straightening his shirt had somehow transformed into something electric, something that made the air between them crackle with unspoken possibilities. Jacob's eyes were dark, searching, and Daniel could feel the weight of 2 years of careful friendship balancing on the edge of something far more dangerous. "I've been in love with you for so long," Daniel thought desperately, watching the way Jacob's thumb traced an unconscious pattern against his collarbone. The confession burned in his throat, begging to be released, but fear held it captive. What if this moment, this perfect, suspended second where anything seemed possible, shattered the instant he spoke the truth? Jacob's breath was warm against his face, and Daniel could smell the faint scent of his cologne mixed with something uniquely him. Time seemed to stretch like honey, thick and golden, as they stood there in the threshold between friendship and something infinitely more complicated. But to understand how they arrived at this moment, this precipice of possibility and terror, we need to go back to where it all began. 3 months earlier, Daniel had been living what most people would consider a perfectly acceptable life. He worked as a graphic designer at a small but successful firm in downtown Portland, shared a spacious apartment with his best friend since college, and maintained a carefully curated social media presence that suggested he had everything figured out. The only problem was the persistent ache in his chest whenever he looked at Jacob Thompson, his roommate, his best friend, and the person he'd been hopelessly in love with for 2 years, 4 months, and 16 days. Not that he was counting. Daniel had become an expert at hiding his feelings, at playing the role of the supportive best friend who listened patiently while Jacob complained about his latest dating disasters. He'd perfected the art of offering relationship advice that he hoped would never actually work, all while dying a little inside every time Jacob brought someone new home. The morning everything changed started like any other. Daniel was sitting at their small kitchen table, nursing his second cup of coffee and pretending to read emails on his laptop, while actually watching Jacob move around their kitchen in nothing but sleep pants and a faded college t-shirt. The early morning light streaming through their windows caught the gold in Jacob's brown hair, and Daniel had to grip his coffee mug tighter to keep his hands from shaking. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. Jacob was making breakfast, humming something under his breath that Daniel didn't recognize but found inexplicably charming anyway. It was such a domestic scene, so perfectly ordinary, that it made Daniel's chest tight with longing. This was what he wanted, this easy morning routine, but with the freedom to reach out and touch, to press a kiss to Jacob's shoulder as he passed, to be more than just a friend sharing space. "Hey," Jacob said suddenly, turning around with a piece of toast in one hand, "can I ask you something weird?" Daniel's heart did a complicated flip. Weird questions from Jacob had a tendency to either be completely innocuous or utterly devastating to Daniel's carefully maintained emotional equilibrium. "Sure," he managed, proud that his voice came out steady. "Do you ever feel like you're just going through the motions?" Jacob leaned against the counter, studying Daniel with those warm brown eyes that had been haunting his dreams for years. "Like you're playing a part in your own life instead of actually living it." The question hit Daniel like a physical blow. He stared at Jacob, wondering if somehow his feelings had become transparent, if Jacob could see straight through to the truth Daniel had been hiding. "What do you mean?" he asked carefully. Jacob ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Daniel had cataloged as meaning he was frustrated or confused about something. "I don't know, it's just I've been thinking about my relationship with Sarah, and before that with Emma, and I keep feeling like something's missing. Like I'm trying to fit into a shape that doesn't quite match who I am." Daniel's pulse quickened. Sarah was Jacob's current girlfriend, a perfectly nice marketing executive who wore expensive perfume and laughed at all the right moments. Daniel had spent countless evenings listening to Jacob's complaints about their relationship, offering advice he didn't mean while secretly hoping they would break up. "Maybe you just haven't found the right person yet," Daniel said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. It was the same generic advice he'd been giving for months, the safe response that kept him in the friend zone, but didn't risk exposing his true feelings. Jacob was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his toast like it held the answers to life's greatest mysteries. Maybe, he said finally, or maybe the problem isn't finding the right person. Maybe the problem is that I don't know what I actually want. The conversation lingered in Daniel's mind for the rest of the day, following him through client meetings and design revisions like a persistent melody. There had been something in Jacob's voice, a vulnerability that Daniel rarely heard, that made him wonder if perhaps his friend was questioning more than just his relationship with Sarah. That evening, Daniel came home to find Jacob sitting on their couch, staring blankly at the television screen where some mindless sitcom was playing. Sarah was nowhere to be seen, which was unusual for a Thursday night. They typically had standing dinner plans. No Sarah tonight, Daniel observed, settling onto the opposite end of the couch with what he hoped looked like casual interest. Jacob glanced over at him, and Daniel was struck by how tired he looked. "We broke up," he said simply. Daniel's heart leaped, but he forced his expression to remain neutral and supportive. "I'm sorry," he lied smoothly. "What happened?" "She said I seemed distant lately." "Distracted." Jacob laughed, but there was no humor in it. "She wasn't wrong. I've been thinking about our conversation this morning, and I realized she deserves someone who's completely present, not someone who's always wondering if there's something else out there." "Something else," Daniel repeated, trying to keep the hope out of his voice. Jacob turned to face him fully, and Daniel was caught off guard by the intensity in his gaze. "Daniel, can I ask you something else that might sound weird?" Daniel nodded, not trusting his voice. "Have you ever wondered what it would be like to kiss a guy?" The question hung in the air between them like a live wire. Daniel felt his entire world tilt on its axis, every carefully constructed wall he'd built around his feelings threatening to crumble. He stared at Jacob, searching his face for any sign that this was some kind of joke or test. But Jacob's expression was serious, almost vulnerable. Daniel started, then stopped. His mouth had gone completely dry. "Why do you ask?" Jacob shrugged, but Daniel could see the tension in his shoulders. "Just curious, I guess. I was talking to my sister last week, and she mentioned that she didn't realize she was attracted to women until she was in college. It got me thinking about how we just assume things about ourselves without really examining them." Daniel's heart was beating so hard, he was sure Jacob could hear it. This was dangerous territory, the kind of conversation that could either change everything or destroy their friendship completely. But Jacob was looking at him with such openness, such genuine curiosity, that Daniel found himself being more honest than he'd been in years. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I have wondered about that." Jacob's eyes widened slightly. "Really? Really?" They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the admission settling between them. Daniel could feel something shifting in the air, like the atmospheric pressure changed before a storm. He wanted to say more, wanted to tell Jacob that he'd done more than wonder, that he'd known for years exactly what it would be like because he'd imagined it countless times. But the words stuck in his throat. "What would it be like, do you think?" Jacob asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something in Jacob's expression that made his breath catch. There was curiosity there, yes, but also something deeper, something that looked almost like longing. "I don't know," Daniel said, which was both completely true and a total lie. "I guess it would depend on the person." Jacob nodded slowly. "Yeah, I guess it would." The conversation ended there, but the tension it had created seemed to settle into the walls of their apartment like smoke. Over the following days, Daniel found himself hyper-aware of every interaction with Jacob, cataloging each lingering glance and accidental touch like a scientist gathering data. Jacob seemed different too, more thoughtful, more likely to let his gaze linger on Daniel's face during conversations. A week after the breakup with Sarah, Daniel came home from work to find Jacob in the kitchen, cooking dinner for both of them. This wasn't unusual. They often cooked for each other, but something about Jacob's demeanor seemed different. He was moving with deliberate care, like he was preparing for something important. "Smells good," Daniel said, hanging his jacket on the back of a chair. "What's the occasion?" Jacob glanced over his shoulder and Daniel caught a flash of nervousness in his expression. "No occasion. I just thought we could have a nice dinner together." "We haven't done that in a while." They ate at their small dining table, talking about work and mutual friends. But Daniel could sense an undercurrent of tension running beneath their normal conversation. Jacob seemed distracted, like he was working up the courage to say something. Finally, as they were finishing their wine, Jacob set down his glass and looked directly at Daniel. "I've been thinking about what we talked about last week," he said. Daniel's pulse quickened. About what specifically? About kissing a guy? About wondering what it would be like? Jacob's cheeks were slightly flushed. Whether from the wine or embarrassment, Daniel couldn't tell. "I can't seem to stop thinking about it." Daniel set down his own wine glass with carefully controlled movements, buying himself time to think. This felt like a precipice, a moment where one wrong word could send everything tumbling into chaos. "What about it?" he asked, proud of how steady his voice sounded. Jacob was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his hands. "I keep wondering if the reason my relationships with women never feel quite right is because I'm missing something fundamental about myself. Like maybe I've been trying to force myself into a shape that doesn't fit." Daniel's heart was racing now. He wanted to reach across the table, to take Jacob's hand and tell him that he understood, that he'd been struggling with the same questions for years. Instead, he forced himself to remain still, to let Jacob work through his thoughts without pressure. "Have you ever felt like that?" Jacob asked, looking up to meet Daniel's eyes. "Like you were pretending to be someone you're not." "Every day," Daniel thought, but what he said was, "sometimes." "I think everyone does to some extent. But this feels different," Jacob continued. "This feels like I've been lying to myself about something fundamental, something important." The vulnerability in Jacob's voice made Daniel's chest tight. He wanted to comfort him, to tell him that questioning yourself was normal and healthy, but he also wanted to be selfish, to push just a little and see where this conversation might lead. "What do you think you've been lying to yourself about?" Daniel asked gently. Jacob was quiet for so long that Daniel began to worry he'd pushed too far. Then, so softly, Daniel almost missed it, Jacob said, "I think I might not be as straight as I thought I was." The words hung in the air between them like a confession, raw and honest and terrifying. Daniel felt his breath catch, felt the world shift around him in ways both subtle and profound. This was it, the moment he'd been hoping for and dreading in equal measure. "That's okay," Daniel said finally. "There's nothing wrong with questioning yourself, with figuring out who you are." Jacob looked at him with something that might have been relief. "You don't think it's weird that I'm just realizing this now?" "I'm 28 years old, Daniel. Shouldn't I have figured this out by now?" "There's no timeline for self-discovery," Daniel replied, and he meant it. "People figure things out when they're ready to figure them out." Jacob nodded, but Daniel could see he was still struggling with something. "There's something else," he said after a moment. "Something I'm not sure how to say." Daniel waited, hardly daring to breathe. "The person I keep thinking about," Jacob said, his voice barely audible. "When I imagine what it would be like, it's not just some hypothetical guy." Daniel's heart stopped completely, then started again at double speed. "Who is it?" he managed to ask. Jacob looked at him for a long moment, and Daniel saw fear and hope and something that looked like longing war across his features. "It's you, Daniel. I keep thinking about what it would be like to kiss you." The confession hit Daniel like a physical blow. He stared at Jacob, searching his face for any sign that this was some kind of cruel joke. But all he saw was sincerity and vulnerability, and a fear that mirrored his own. "Jacob," Daniel said, his voice rough with emotion. "I know it's weird," Jacob rushed on. "I know it might ruin everything between us, but I can't stop thinking about it. About you. About us. And I needed to tell you because keeping it inside was driving me crazy." Daniel felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. He dreamed of this moment for so long that it felt surreal, like he might wake up at any second and find himself alone in his bed, heartbreaking all over again. "It's not weird," Daniel said quietly, "and it won't ruin everything." Jacob's eyes widened. "It won't." Daniel took a deep breath, gathering every ounce of courage he possessed. "No, it won't. Because I've been thinking about the same thing. About you. For a really long time." "How long?" Jacob asked, his voice barely a whisper. 2 years, Daniel admitted. 2 years, 4 months, and 16 days. Not that I was counting. Jacob stared at him in amazement. "You've been all this time, you've been in love with you?" Daniel finished. "Completely, hopelessly in love with you." The silence that followed was different from any they'd shared before. It was charged with possibility, heavy with the weight of mutual confession. Daniel could see Jacob processing this information, working through the implications of what they'd both just admitted. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" Jacob asked finally. "Because I was terrified," Daniel said honestly. "Terrified of losing you, terrified of ruining our friendship, terrified that you'd never feel the same way." Jacob reached across the table then, his fingers finding Daniel's and intertwining with them. The touch was electric, sending shockwaves up Daniel's arm and straight to his heart. "But I do feel the same way," Jacob said. "I think I have for a while, I just didn't know how to recognize it." They sat there for a moment, hands linked across the dinner table, both of them trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. Daniel felt like he was floating, like gravity had temporarily released its hold on him. "So what happens now?" Jacob asked. Daniel looked at their joined hands, then up at Jacob's face. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I've never been here before." "Me neither," Jacob admitted. "But I'd like to find out, together." They moved to the couch after dinner, sitting closer together than they ever had before. Jacob's thigh pressed against Daniel's in a way that made concentration nearly impossible. They talked for hours, sharing stories and feelings that had been locked away for months or years. Jacob told Daniel about the dreams he'd been having, the way he'd started noticing men in ways he'd never allowed himself to before. Daniel shared the agony of listening to Jacob's relationship troubles, of offering advice he'd never wanted to give. "I feel like such an idiot," Jacob said at one point, running his free hand through his hair. "All those times I complained to you about Sarah, about Emma, about how something was missing. You must have wanted to shake me." Daniel squeezed Jacob's hand, which he'd been holding for the better part of an hour. "I wanted to tell you what was missing," he said, "but I was too scared." "What would you have said," Jacob asked, turning to face him fully, "if you hadn't been scared?" Daniel met his gaze, feeling brave in a way he'd never experienced before. "I would have said that you were looking for something in them that they could never give you, because what you were looking for was sitting right next to you, loving you quietly and hoping someday you'd notice." Jacob's breath caught. "Daniel," he said softly, "I would have told you that every time you describe what you wanted in a relationship, you were describing what we already had," Jacob continued. "The easy conversation, the comfortable silences, the way we take care of each other without even thinking about it." Jacob was staring at him with an expression Daniel had never seen before, something soft and wondering and full of recognition. "We do have that, don't we?" he said. "We do," Daniel confirmed. "We have everything except the physical intimacy." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Jacob's gaze dropped to Daniel's lips for just a moment before meeting his eyes again. "Can I?" he started, then stopped. "Can I try something?" Daniel nodded, not trusting his voice. Jacob shifted closer, close enough that Daniel could feel his breath against his face. His hand came up to cup Daniel's cheek, thumb brushing across his cheekbone in a gesture so tender it made Daniel's eyes flutter closed. "Is this okay?" Jacob whispered. "More than okay," Daniel managed to say. Jacob leaned in slowly, giving Daniel plenty of time to pull away if he wanted to. But Daniel had never wanted anything less than to pull away. He'd been waiting for this moment for over 2 years, and now that it was finally happening, he felt like every nerve ending in his body was on fire. When Jacob's lips finally touched his, it was soft and hesitant, a question rather than a statement. Daniel answered by kissing him back, his hand coming up to rest on Jacob's chest, feeling his heart racing beneath his palm. The kiss deepened gradually, hesitancy melting away as they both realized how right this felt, how perfectly they fit together. Jacob's other hand found the back of Daniel's neck, fingers tangling in his hair, and Daniel made a soft sound that seemed to encourage him. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. Jacob rested his forehead against Daniel's, and Daniel could see wonder in his eyes. "Wow," Jacob said softly. "Yeah," Daniel agreed, his voice rough. "Wow. That was," Jacob started, then shook his head. "I've never felt anything like that before." Daniel's heart swelled. "Neither have I," he said, which was true. He'd kissed other people before, but never with this sense of rightness, of coming home. They stayed like that for a moment, foreheads touching, sharing the same air. Daniel felt like he was glowing from the inside out, like every cell in his body was singing with joy. "I'm scared," Jacob admitted quietly. "Me too," Daniel said, "but good scared or bad scared?" Jacob considered this. Good scared, I think. Like standing at the edge of a cliff and knowing you're about to fly. Daniel smiled. That's exactly what it feels like. They talked until nearly 3 in the morning, sharing kisses between conversations, exploring this new dimension of their relationship with careful wonder. Jacob confessed that he'd been having dreams about Daniel for weeks, dreams that had confused and frightened him until tonight. Daniel admitted that he'd been in love with Jacob almost from the moment they'd met, that every day of their friendship had been both a gift and a torture. When they finally went to their separate bedrooms, it was with the understanding that everything had changed, that they were no longer just friends but something infinitely more precious and complicated. Daniel lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the evening, every touch and kiss and whispered confession. He felt like he was vibrating with happiness, like his body couldn't contain all the joy and relief and love that was coursing through him. In the next room, he could hear Jacob moving around, probably experiencing his own version of post-confession insomnia. The thought made Daniel smile. Tomorrow, they would have to figure out what this meant, how to navigate this new reality. But for tonight, it was enough to know that Jacob felt the same way, that the love Daniel had been carrying alone for over 2 years was finally shared. The next morning brought a brief moment of panic when Daniel woke up wondering if the previous night had been an elaborate dream. But then he walked into the kitchen and found Jacob making coffee, and the soft smile Jacob gave him, shy and full of affection, confirmed that it had all been beautifully, impossibly real. Morning, Jacob said, and there was something different in his voice, something warm and intimate that made Daniel's chest tight with happiness. Morning, Daniel replied, moving to stand next to Jacob at the counter. They stood there for a moment, close enough to touch but not quite touching, both of them seeming to navigate this new dynamic. How did you sleep? Jacob asked, glancing at Daniel with those warm brown eyes that no longer had to hide what they were feeling. Not much, Daniel admitted. Too much to think about. Jacob nodded. Same here. Good thoughts, though. Very good thoughts, Daniel agreed. Jacob turned to face him fully, and Daniel could see a question in his expression. Can I, he started, then seemed to gather his courage. Can I kiss you good morning? Is that something we do now? The tentative hope in Jacob's voice made Daniel's heart melt. I'd like that to be something we do now, he said softly. Jacob smiled, that brilliant smile that had been breaking Daniel's heart for years, and leaned in to press a soft kiss to Daniel's lips. It was brief and sweet, nothing like the passionate kisses they'd shared the night before, but it felt significant in a different way. It felt like a promise, like the beginning of a new routine. When they broke apart, Jacob rested his hand on Daniel's waist, a casual touch that felt revolutionary. So what happens now, he asked. Do we tell people? Do we figure out what we are first? Daniel considered this. I think we figure out what we are first, he said. Take some time to explore this without outside pressure. Jacob nodded. That sounds smart. I'm still processing all of this, to be honest. Yesterday I thought I was straight, and today I'm kissing my male roommate, and it feels like the most natural thing in the world. Daniel laughed softly. Sexuality is more fluid than most people think. You don't have to put a label on it right away. Thank you, Jacob said, and Daniel could hear the gratitude in his voice, for being patient with me while I figure this out. Daniel reached up to cup Jacob's cheek, thumb brushing across his cheekbone in a mirror of the gesture Jacob had made the night before. We'll figure it out together, he said. No pressure, no timeline, just us. Jacob leaned into the touch, eyes fluttering closed for a moment. I love that, he said. Just us. They spent the weekend in a bubble of tentative exploration and deepening intimacy. They took long walks through their neighborhood, hands linked, talking about everything and nothing. They cooked meals together with a new awareness of each other's presence. Small touches and stolen kisses punctuating their domestic routine. Saturday night, they watched a movie on the couch. Jacob's head pillowed on Daniel's shoulder, Daniel's fingers running through Jacob's hair. It was such a simple thing, but Daniel felt like he might burst with happiness. This was what he'd been longing for, this easy intimacy, this sense of belonging. During a quiet moment in the film, Jacob tilted his head to look up at Daniel. Can I tell you something, he said. Always, Daniel replied. I keep waiting for this to feel weird or wrong, Jacob said. But it doesn't. It feels like the most right thing I've ever done. Daniel's heart swelled. It feels right to me too, he said. Like we were always supposed to end up here. Jacob shifted so he could face Daniel fully. Do you think we were, he asked, supposed to end up here? Daniel considered this. I don't know if I believe in destiny, he said slowly, but I believe in us. I believe that what we have is rare and precious and worth fighting for. Jacob smiled, that soft smile that was becoming Daniel's favorite thing in the world. I believe in us too, he said. They kissed then, slow and sweet, and Daniel felt like he was exactly where he belonged. Sunday brought their first real challenge when Jacob's phone rang and Sarah's name appeared on the screen. Jacob stared at it for a moment, then looked at Daniel with a slightly panicked expression. I should probably answer this, he said. Daniel nodded, trying to ignore the spike of jealousy that shot through him. Of course. Jacob answered the call, and Daniel tried not to listen too closely to the conversation, but it was impossible to ignore Jacob's increasingly tense responses. When he finally hung up, he looked troubled. She wants to talk, Jacob said. She thinks maybe we were too hasty in breaking up. Daniel felt his stomach drop. What did you tell her? That I needed some time to think, Jacob replied, running a hand through his hair in that familiar gesture of frustration. But Daniel, I don't need time to think. I know what I want. What do you want? Daniel asked, even though he was terrified of the answer. Jacob moved closer, taking Daniel's hands in his. You, he said simply. I want you. I want this. Whatever this is, wherever it leads, I want to explore it with you. Relief flooded through Daniel so powerfully he felt dizzy. But what about Sarah? He asked. I need to talk to her, Jacob said. I need to be honest with her and with myself. She deserves that. Daniel nodded, understanding but still feeling anxious about the conversation to come. That evening, Jacob went to meet Sarah at a coffee shop downtown. Daniel stayed home, trying to distract himself with work, but mostly just pacing around their apartment and checking his phone every few minutes. The rational part of his brain knew that Jacob had made his choice, but the anxious part couldn't stop imagining scenarios where Sarah convinced him to give their relationship another try. When Jacob finally came home, nearly 2 hours later, Daniel was sitting on the couch pretending to read a book. Jacob looked emotionally drained, but also somehow lighter, like he'd set down a heavy burden. How did it go? Daniel asked, setting aside his book. Jacob sat down next to him, close enough that their knees touched. Hard, he said, but necessary. I told her the truth, or as much of it as I could. What did you tell her? That I've been questioning my sexuality and that I've developed feelings for someone else, someone who makes me understand what I've been missing in all my relationships. Daniel's heart did a complicated flip. How did she take it? She was upset, obviously, Jacob said, but I think she also wasn't completely surprised. She said she'd sensed that I was pulling away, that there was something I wasn't telling her. Daniel reached for Jacob's hand, intertwining their fingers. I'm sorry it was difficult. Jacob squeezed his hand. I'm not. It feels good to be honest, to stop pretending. And Daniel, she said something that really stuck with me. What was that? She said that she'd always felt like she was competing with someone for my attention, but she could never figure out who. Now she knows. Daniel felt a flush of guilt. I never wanted to come between you and anyone else. Jacob turned to face him fully. Daniel, you didn't come between us. What we have, what we've always had, it's not something that can be forced or faked with someone else. It's unique to us. They spent the evening talking through Jacob's conversation with Sarah, processing the emotions that came with officially closing that chapter of his life. Daniel found himself feeling sympathy for Sarah, understanding how difficult it must have been to love someone who was fundamentally unavailable, even if Jacob hadn't realized it at the time. That night, as they were getting ready for bed, Jacob appeared in Daniel's doorway looking uncertain. Would it be okay, he started, then stopped and tried again. Would it be okay if I slept in here tonight? I don't want to be alone. Daniel's heart melted. Of course, he said, pulling back the covers. Come here. Jacob climbed into bed next to him, and they lay facing each other in the dim light from the street lamp outside. Jacob looked young and vulnerable, and Daniel felt a fierce surge of protectiveness. Are you okay? Daniel asked softly. I am, Jacob said, and he sounded surprised by his own certainty. I really am. For the first time in months, maybe years, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Daniel reached out to cup Jacob's cheek, thumb brushing across his skin. Where's that, he asked, though he thought he knew the answer. Here, Jacob said simply. With you. They kissed then, soft and slow, and Daniel felt like his heart might burst from the sweetness of it. When they broke apart, Jacob settled against Daniel's chest, and Daniel wrapped his arms around him, holding him close. I love you, Daniel whispered into the darkness, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Jacob went very still for a moment, and Daniel felt a spike of panic. Had he said too much too soon? But then Jacob lifted his head to look at Daniel, and even in the dim light, Daniel could see the emotion in his eyes. I love you too, Jacob said. I think I have for a long time. I just didn't know how to recognize it. Daniel felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. Really? Really, Jacob confirmed. All those times I complained about feeling like something was missing, like I was just going through the motions. It was because I was trying to find with other people what I already had with you. They held each other close that night, whispering confessions and promises in the darkness, and Daniel felt like he was finally, truly home. The next few weeks passed in a blur of discovery and deepening intimacy. They learned each other's rhythms in this new context, figured out how to navigate the shift from friendship to romance. There were moments of awkwardness, times when old habits clashed with new realities, but overall the transition felt surprisingly natural. Jacob threw himself into exploring this new aspect of his identity with the same enthusiasm he brought to everything else. He read articles about sexual fluidity, watched movies with LGBTQ themes, and asked Daniel endless questions about his own journey of self-discovery. When did you first know you were attracted to men? Jacob asked one evening as they cooked dinner together. Daniel considered this as he chopped vegetables. I think I always knew on some level, he said, but I didn't let myself acknowledge it until college. There was this guy in my art history class, and I found myself looking forward to seeing him every day, thinking about him constantly. That's when I finally admitted to myself what I'd been trying to ignore. Jacob nodded thoughtfully. I keep looking back at my friendships with guys and wondering if what I thought was just admiration was actually attraction. It's possible, Daniel said. Compulsory heterosexuality is a real thing. We're taught from such a young age that attraction to the opposite sex is the default, that we don't always recognize when our feelings don't fit that mold. Jacob was quiet for a moment, stirring the sauce with more concentration than it required. Daniel, he said finally, can I ask you something that might sound insecure? Of course. Do you think I'm just experimenting? Jacob asked, not meeting Daniel's eyes. Do you think this is just a phase or something I'm doing because I'm confused about what I want? Daniel set down his knife and turned to face Jacob fully, recognizing the vulnerability in his question. The fact that Jacob was worried about this told Daniel how seriously he was taking their relationship, how much he wanted to get it right. I think you're discovering something about yourself that was always there, Daniel said gently. I don't think you can fake the way you respond to me, the way your whole face lights up when I walk into a room. That's not experimentation. That's genuine feeling. Jacob finally met his eyes, and Daniel could see relief there. I feel like I'm seeing color for the first time, he said, like I've been living in black and white, and suddenly the world is full of possibilities I never knew existed. Daniel smiled. That's exactly how it should feel when you stop fighting who you are and start embracing it. They were interrupted by a knock at the door, and Daniel went to answer it while Jacob continued cooking. He was surprised to find Lionel Wilson, one of their mutual friends from college, standing in the hallway with a bottle of wine and a grin. Surprise, Lionel said. I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd drop by. Hope you don't mind the impromptu visit. Daniel glanced back toward the kitchen where he could hear Jacob moving around. They hadn't discussed how to handle situations like this, whether they were ready to tell their friends about their relationship. Of course not, Daniel said, stepping aside to let Lionel in. Jacob's here too. We were just making dinner. Perfect, Lionel said, following Daniel into the kitchen. Jacob, my man, how are you? Daniel watched nervously as Jacob turned to greet their friend, wondering how he would handle the situation. But Jacob seemed relaxed, giving Lionel a warm hug and asking about his recent promotion at work. They invited Lionel to stay for dinner, and Daniel found himself studying the interaction between his boyfriend and their friend, looking for any signs of discomfort or awkwardness. But Jacob seemed completely at ease, laughing at Lionel's stories and contributing his own anecdotes from work. It wasn't until they were cleaning up after dinner that Daniel realized what had been different about Jacob's behavior. He'd been more tactile than usual, finding excuses to touch Daniel's shoulder as he passed, standing closer than strictly necessary while they washed dishes. It was subtle, nothing that would necessarily register as romantic to someone who wasn't looking for it, but it felt like Jacob's way of maintaining their connection even in the presence of others. After Lionel left, Daniel brought up what he'd observed. "You seem comfortable tonight," he said as they finished putting away the dishes. "I was," Jacob replied, sounding a little surprised by his own admission. "I thought I'd be nervous about hiding this from him, but it didn't feel like hiding. It felt like we were just being ourselves." Daniel smiled. "We were being ourselves. A version of ourselves that's more honest than we've ever been before." Jacob moved closer, slipping his arms around Daniel's waist. "I like this version of us," he said. "Me too," Daniel replied, leaning in to kiss him softly. The following weekend brought another test when Jacob's sister called to say she was coming to town for a quick visit. Lauren Watson had always been protective of Jacob, and Daniel knew she'd been less than impressed with his previous girlfriends. The thought of meeting her approval as Jacob's boyfriend was both thrilling and terrifying. "Should I tell her about us?" Jacob asked as they prepared for her arrival. "Do you want to?" Daniel asked. Jacob considered this. "I do," he said. "I want her to know that I'm happy, that I've figured out something important about myself. But I'm nervous about how she'll react." Daniel took Jacob's hand, squeezing gently. "Whatever her reaction is, we'll handle it together." Lauren arrived that afternoon with her usual whirlwind energy, hugging both of them and immediately launching into stories about her job and her latest dating disasters. She was a few years older than Jacob, with the same warm brown eyes and infectious laugh. Over dinner, Daniel found himself watching the siblings interact, noting the easy affection between them and the way Lauren seemed to genuinely care about Jacob's happiness. When she asked about Sarah, Jacob took a deep breath and launched into an explanation that was both honest and careful. "We broke up a few weeks ago," he said. "I realized I wasn't being fair to her, that I was looking for something she couldn't give me." Lauren raised an eyebrow. "What kind of something?" Jacob glanced at Daniel, who gave him an encouraging nod. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about what I want in a relationship," Jacob continued, "about who I am and what makes me happy. And I've realized that I've been limiting myself, making assumptions about what my life should look like instead of paying attention to what actually feels right." Lauren was studying her brother with the intense focus Daniel had learned to associate with the Watson family. "You're being very cryptic," she said. "What are you trying to tell me?" Jacob reached over and took Daniel's hand, intertwining their fingers on the table where Lauren could see. "I'm trying to tell you that I'm in love with Daniel and that he loves me back, and that I've never been happier in my life." Lauren's eyes widened, her gaze moving from their joined hands to Jacob's face, to Daniel's and back again. She was quiet for a long moment, processing this information, and Daniel felt his heart racing as he waited for her reaction. Finally, Lauren smiled, and it was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. "Well," she said, "it's about damn time." Jacob blinked in surprise. "That's your reaction." "Jacob," Lauren said, leaning forward with an expression that was part exasperation and part affection, "I've been watching you go through relationship after relationship, complaining that something was missing, that you couldn't connect with anyone the way you wanted to. And the whole time you've been talking about Daniel like he hung the moon." She turned to Daniel with a grin. "And you, mister, have been pining so obviously that it was painful to watch. I was starting to wonder if I was going to have to lock you two in a room together until you figured it out." Daniel felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment. Was it really that obvious? To someone who loves you both and wants you to be happy? "Yes," Lauren said. "To Jacob, apparently not so much, but he's always been a little dense about these things." "Hey," Jacob protested, but he was smiling. Lauren reached across the table to squeeze both of their hands. "I'm happy for you," she said sincerely. "Both of you, you belong together. Anyone with eyes can see that." The rest of Lauren's visit passed in a blur of easy conversation and shared laughter. Having her approval meant more to both Daniel and Jacob than they'd realized, and her enthusiastic support gave them confidence about sharing their relationship with others. After Lauren left, they found themselves settling into a comfortable routine as a couple. They told their other close friends gradually, most of whom reacted with the variations of Lauren's sentiment that it was about time. Their coworkers were supportive, and Daniel's family, when he finally called to tell them, were thrilled that he'd found someone who made him so happy. The only real challenge came from an unexpected source. About a month into their official relationship, they ran into Sarah at a coffee shop downtown. Daniel saw her first and felt his stomach clench with anxiety, but Jacob handled the encounter with grace and kindness. "Sarah," Jacob said, approaching her table, "how are you doing?" She looked up from her laptop, and Daniel could see surprise and something else, maybe sadness, flicker across her face when she saw them together. "I'm good," she said, though her voice was slightly strained. "Better every day." Jacob introduced Daniel as his boyfriend, and while the moment was awkward, Sarah was polite. She even managed to say she was glad Jacob had found happiness, though Daniel could hear the effort it took. After they left the coffee shop, Jacob was quiet for a while. Finally, as they walked home, he said, "I feel bad that I hurt her." "You didn't hurt her on purpose," Daniel replied. "You were trying to figure out who you are, and that's not something you should apologize for." "I know," Jacob said, "but I still wish I could have spared her that pain." Daniel stopped walking and turned to face Jacob. "The fact that you care about her feelings, even now, is one of the things I love about you," he said. "But you can't live your life trying to protect other people from the consequences of your self-discovery. You have a right to be happy, to be authentic." Jacob smiled, leaning in to kiss Daniel softly. "When did you get so wise?" he asked. "I had a good teacher," Daniel replied. "You've taught me a lot about courage over the past few months." As spring turned to summer, their relationship deepened and evolved. They had their first fight, a minor disagreement about whose turn it was to do laundry that escalated into something bigger, before they both realized how ridiculous they were being. Making up was sweet and thorough, and they learned that they could disagree without threatening the foundation of what they'd built together. They had their first "I love you" during daylight hours, whispered over morning coffee when Jacob caught Daniel staring at him with an expression of such open adoration that he couldn't help but comment on it. "What are you thinking about?" Jacob asked, reaching over to brush a strand of hair away from Daniel's face. "Just how much I love you," Daniel replied without thinking, then felt his cheeks warm. "Sorry, I know I say it a lot." "Don't apologize," Jacob said, leaning in to kiss him. "I love hearing it. I love saying it back. I love you, Daniel Phillips, more than I ever thought it was possible to love another person." They talked about the future tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. Jacob wanted to travel, to see places he'd only read about, and Daniel wanted to show him the world. They talked about getting a bigger apartment, maybe adopting a dog, building a life together that felt authentic and true. One evening in late July, as they sat on their small balcony watching the sunset, Jacob brought up something that had been on his mind. "I've been thinking about labels," he said, not looking at Daniel but staring out at the city skyline. "What about them?" Daniel asked, though he thought he knew where this conversation was heading. "I know I don't need to put a label on my sexuality," Jacob said. "You've been very clear about that, and I appreciate it, but I think I want to." Daniel waited, giving Jacob the space to work through his thoughts. "I think I'm bisexual," Jacob continued. "I'm attracted to you, obviously, but I don't think my attraction to women was fake or forced. I think I'm capable of loving people regardless of gender, but I've found the person I want to love for the rest of my life, and that person happens to be a man." Daniel felt his heart swell with pride and love. "How does it feel to say that?" he asked. "Good," Jacob said, finally turning to meet Daniel's eyes. "Really good, like another piece of the puzzle clicking into place." "I'm proud of you," Daniel said, "for doing the work to figure out who you are." Jacob smiled. "I couldn't have done it without you. You gave me a safe space to explore, to question, to be uncertain. That's a gift I'll never take for granted." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sky change colors as the sun set behind the buildings. Daniel felt a profound sense of contentment, of rightness, that he'd never experienced before. This was what happiness felt like, he realized. Not the fleeting joy of a good day or a pleasant surprise, but the deep, abiding satisfaction of being exactly where you belonged, with exactly the right person. As autumn approached, they faced their first major test as a couple when Daniel was offered a promotion that would require him to relocate to Seattle for 6 months. It was an incredible opportunity, the kind of career advancement he'd been working toward for years. But the thought of leaving Jacob filled him with dread. "You have to take it," Jacob said when Daniel told him about the offer. "This is everything you've been working for." "But what about us?" Daniel asked. "6 months is a long time." Jacob was quiet for a moment, and Daniel could see him thinking through the implications. "What if I came with you?" he said finally. Daniel's heart leaped. "You'd do that. I can work remotely for a while," Jacob said. "And Seattle's not that far from Portland. We could make it work." They spent the next week discussing the logistics, weighing the pros and cons, talking through their fears and hopes. In the end, they decided to take the leap together, to see this as an adventure rather than a challenge. The move to Seattle was hectic and stressful, but it also brought them closer together. Living in a new city where they didn't know anyone forced them to rely on each other in new ways. They explored their temporary neighborhood together, found new favorite restaurants, created new routines and traditions. One evening, about 3 months into their Seattle adventure, they were walking along the waterfront when Jacob stopped suddenly and turned to face Daniel. "What is it?" Daniel asked, concerned by the serious expression on Jacob's face. "I need to tell you something," Jacob said, "something I've been thinking about for weeks." Daniel felt a familiar spike of anxiety. "Okay." Jacob took his hands, holding them gently but firmly. "I know we haven't been together very long in the grand scheme of things," he said. "I know we're still figuring out a lot of things about ourselves and each other." Daniel's heart was starting to race. "Jacob," he started, but Jacob shook his head. "Let me finish," Jacob said. "I know all of that, but I also know that I've never been more certain of anything in my life than I am of this, of us. I know that I want to build a life with you, not just for the next few months or years, but for as long as you'll have me." Daniel stared at him, hardly daring to breathe. "I'm not proposing," Jacob said quickly, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Not yet anyway, but I'm promising you that someday I will be. I'm promising you that this isn't just a phase or an experiment or a rebound. This is it for me, Daniel. You're it for me." Daniel felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. "Jacob," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I love you," Jacob continued. "I love your kindness and your patience and the way you make me feel like the best version of myself. I love how you supported me while I figured out who I was, never pushing but always believing in me. I love the life we're building together, and I want to keep building it for the rest of our lives." Daniel couldn't speak for a moment, overwhelmed by the depth of emotion in Jacob's words. When he finally found his voice, it came out as barely more than a whisper. "I love you too," he said. "So much that sometimes I can't believe this is real, that you're real, that you chose me." "I'll keep choosing you," Jacob said, "every day for as long as you will let me." They kissed then, right there on the waterfront, with the Seattle skyline glittering behind them, and Daniel felt like his heart might burst from happiness. This was what he'd been waiting for his whole life without even knowing it. This sense of complete and utter rightness, of finding the person who made everything else make sense. When they broke apart, both of them were smiling through tears. "We should probably head back," Daniel said eventually. "It's getting cold." Jacob nodded, but he didn't move to leave. He was looking at Daniel with an expression so full of love and wonder that it took Daniel's breath away. "What?" Daniel asked. "I just can't believe how lucky I am," Jacob said. "2 years ago, I was stumbling through relationships that never felt quite right, wondering what was wrong with me. And now I'm here with you, and everything finally makes sense." Daniel reached up to cup Jacob's cheek, thumb brushing across his skin. "Nothing was wrong with you," he said. "You just hadn't found your person yet." "My person," Jacob repeated, like he was testing the words. "I like that." "Good," Daniel said, leaning in to kiss him again. "Because that's what you are. My person, my partner, my home." They walked back to their temporary apartment hand in hand, talking about their plans for the weekend, for the following month, for the years stretching out ahead of them. Daniel felt like he was floating, buoyed by the certainty in Jacob's voice when he talked about their future together. That night, as they lay in bed together, Jacob's head pillowed on Daniel's chest, Daniel found himself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. All those months of hiding his feelings, of watching Jacob struggle through unsatisfying relationships, of wondering if he'd ever find the courage to speak his truth. It seemed impossible that they were here now, together, and happy, and planning a future that included both of them. Daniel, Jacob said sleepily, his voice muffled against Daniel's chest. Thank you, Jacob said. For what? Daniel asked, running his fingers through Jacob's hair. For loving me enough to wait, Jacob said. For being patient while I figured out who I was. For never making me feel rushed or pressured. For being exactly what I needed, even when I didn't know I needed it. Daniel felt his throat tighten with emotion. Thank you for being brave enough to explore this with me, he replied. For taking the risk, for trusting me with your heart. Jacob lifted his head to look at Daniel, and even in the dim light from the street lamp outside, Daniel could see the love in his eyes. Always, Jacob said simply. They returned to Portland just before Christmas, both of them eager to see their friends and family and to settle back into their regular routines. Daniel's promotion had been confirmed as permanent, with the understanding that he could work remotely most of the time, traveling to Seattle only when necessary. Their homecoming was marked by a party thrown by Lauren and their college friends, a celebration that felt less like a welcome home and more like a recognition of how much they'd both grown during their time away. Daniel watched Jacob interact with their friends, noting the confidence in his posture, the easy way he talked about their relationship, the casual affection he showed Daniel in public. It's amazing how much you've both changed, Lionel commented to Daniel during a quiet moment in the kitchen. I mean, you're clearly the same people, but there's something different about you. You seem more settled, more sure of yourselves. Daniel smiled, glancing over to where Jacob was telling an animated story to a group of their friends. We are more sure, he said. We know who we are, individually and together. That makes everything else easier. It shows, Lionel said. You're good together, really good. As the new year began, Daniel and Jacob fell into a rhythm that felt both comfortable and exciting. They were planning a trip to Europe for the spring, talking about adopting a dog, considering whether they wanted to buy a house together. These conversations felt natural and right, the kind of future planning that came from being certain about your partner and your relationship. One evening in February, as they were cooking dinner together, Jacob brought up something that had been on his mind. I've been thinking about coming out to my parents, he said, not looking up from the vegetables he was chopping. Daniel's hands stilled on the pasta he was stirring. How are you feeling about that? Nervous, Jacob admitted. But ready, I think. I want them to know who I really am, and I want them to understand how important you are to me. They talked through Jacob's concerns and fears, discussing different approaches and potential reactions. Daniel offered to be there for support, but Jacob felt like this was something he needed to do on his own first. The conversation with Jacob's parents took place the following weekend, over video calls since they lived across the country. Daniel waited in their bedroom while Jacob talked to them in the living room, trying to distract himself with a book, but mostly just listening to the murmur of voices and trying to gauge Jacob's emotional state from his tone. When Jacob finally came to find him, nearly an hour later, his eyes were red, but he was smiling. How did it go? Daniel asked, setting aside his book. Better than I expected, Jacob said, sitting down on the bed next to Daniel. They were surprised, obviously, but they were also really supportive. My mom cried a little, but she said she just wanted me to be happy. And your dad? Daniel asked. He was quiet for a while, Jacob said. But then he said he'd noticed that I seemed different lately, happier and more confident, and that if you were the reason for that, then he was grateful to you. Daniel felt his eyes well up with tears. They want to meet me, don't they? Jacob nodded, grinning. They want to fly out for a visit next month. Mom specifically requested that we cook dinner for them so she can see us in our natural habitat, as she put it. Daniel laughed, feeling a mix of excitement and terror at the prospect of meeting Jacob's parents as his boyfriend. We can do that, he said. I'd love to meet them. The visit from Jacob's parents went better than either of them had dared to hope. Jacob's mother, Maria Edwards, was warm and welcoming, treating Daniel like a son from the moment they met. His father, Benjamin Johnson, was more reserved but clearly trying to make an effort, asking Daniel about his work and his interests with genuine curiosity. Over dinner, Maria shared stories about Jacob's childhood, and Daniel found himself falling a little bit in love with the family dynamic he was being welcomed into. There was so much love in the room, so much acceptance and support, that it made his chest tight with gratitude. After his parents left, Jacob was quiet for a while, processing the visit and what it meant for their relationship. That evening, as they cleaned up the kitchen together, he finally spoke. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop," he said, "for something to go wrong, for this to be too good to be true." Daniel set down the dish he was drying and turned to face Jacob. "What would convince you that this is real?" he asked. "That we're real." Jacob considered this. "Time, I think," he said finally. "More experiences together, more proof that we can handle whatever life throws at us." Daniel nodded. "We have time," he said. "All the time in the world." Spring brought new challenges and new joys. They adopted a rescue dog, a golden retriever mix named Charlie, who immediately claimed both of their hearts and most of their couch. They took their planned trip to Europe, spending 2 weeks exploring cities and countryside, creating memories that would last a lifetime. It was in Paris, sitting at a sidewalk cafe watching the world go by, that Jacob brought up marriage for the first time. "Do you want to get married someday?" he asked, seemingly out of nowhere. Daniel nearly choked on his coffee. "That's a loaded question," he said when he'd recovered. "I know," Jacob said, "but I've been thinking about it a lot lately, about what it would mean, what it would look like for us." Daniel studied Jacob's face, trying to gauge how serious he was about this conversation. "What conclusions have you come to?" he asked. "That I want everything with you," Jacob said simply. "The whole traditional package, if you want it too. Marriage, maybe kids someday, growing old together. All of it." Daniel felt his heart skip a beat. Even a year ago, he never would have imagined Jacob saying these words to him. The transformation from pining friend to beloved partner still felt miraculous sometimes. "I want all of that too," Daniel said quietly. "With you." Jacob smiled, reaching across the table to take Daniel's hand. "Good," he said, "because I've been carrying around a ring for 3 weeks, waiting for the right moment to ask." Daniel stared at him in shock. "You what?" Jacob laughed at Daniel's expression. "I'm not proposing right now," he said quickly. "I want to do it properly, somewhere that means something to us. But I wanted you to know that I'm serious about this, about us, about our future together." Daniel felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. "Jacob Thompson," he said, shaking his head in amazement. "You continue to surprise me." "Good," Jacob said, bringing Daniel's hand to his lips to press a soft kiss to his ankles. "I plan to keep surprising you for the next 60 years or so." They finished their trip with a new sense of anticipation, both of them wondering when and how Jacob would actually propose. Daniel found himself paying attention to their surroundings in a new way, wondering if each beautiful location might be the one Jacob had chosen. The proposal, when it finally came, was perfect in its simplicity. They were back in Portland, walking through the park where they'd had so many important conversations over the years. It was a Sunday morning in late spring, the kind of day that made the whole world seem full of possibility. Jacob stopped at a bench overlooking the river, the same bench where they'd sat months earlier when Jacob had first confessed his confusion about his sexuality. "Daniel," he said, turning to face him, "do you remember what we talked about here?" "Of course," Daniel replied. "That was the beginning of everything for us." Jacob nodded. "That was the day I started being honest with myself about who I am and what I want. And what I want, what I've wanted from that day forward, is a life with you." Jacob dropped to one knee right there on the path, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. "Daniel Phillips," he said, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. "You've been my best friend, my partner, my home, and the love of my life. Will you marry me?" Daniel looked down at Jacob, this man who had transformed from his impossible dream into his beautiful reality, and felt his heart overflow with love and joy and gratitude. "Yes," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, of course, yes." Jacob slipped the ring onto Daniel's finger with shaking hands, then stood up so Daniel could kiss him properly. They held each other there in the park where their love story had truly begun, both of them crying and laughing and overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they'd built together. As they walked home hand in hand, Daniel found himself thinking about that moment months ago when Jacob had fixed his collar and let his hands linger. That simple touch had been the beginning of everything, the first crack in the wall they'd both built around their true feelings. Now here they were, engaged and planning a future together, all because Jacob had been brave enough to let his hands say what his words couldn't yet express. We should call everyone, Jacob said as they climbed the stairs to their apartment. Tell them the news. In a minute, Daniel said, stopping on their doorstep. First, I want to savor this moment. Just the two of us. Jacob smiled, leaning in to kiss him softly. I love you, Daniel Phillips, soon to be Daniel Thompson. I love you too, Daniel replied. More than I ever thought it was possible to love another person. They stood there in their doorway, holding each other and marveling at the journey that had brought them to this moment. From friends to lovers to fiancés, they had navigated every transition with patience and love, an unwavering commitment to each other's happiness. As they finally went inside to start making phone calls and planning their future, Daniel reflected on how perfectly their story had unfolded. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories were the ones that caught you completely off guard, that grew from friendship into something deeper and more lasting than either person had dared to imagine. He looked at the ring on his finger, then at Jacob's radiant face, and knew with absolute certainty that they were both exactly where they needed to be, together, forever, having found in each other the missing piece that made everything else make sense.